Welcome back. So now what we're going to talk about is Lachmann's capital theory. Okay. Now, this is important for a few reasons, and it's quite different from other forms of Austrian economics and also other forms from neoclassical economics. It's different from other forms of Austrian economics because, unlike Schumpeter and Kirchner, he says very specifically that an entrepreneur needs to invest their capital and have it tied up for a certain period of time before you get a return on it. In other words, you've got to make an investment and wait some time before you start getting to harvest that investment. Now again, most of us think, well, duh, that makes total sense. You've got to invest and wait. But again, he was one of the first to actually theorize about this. Okay? Think people like Schumpeter and Kirchner kind of said, well, an entrepreneur kind of understands the opportunity, and then they just kind of perceive it, and somehow the capital just kind of works out. We all know that's not true. And of course, I would add that normally we think of different kinds of capital. Okay? Sorry about that. I know that's harsh. Okay? You have financial capital. And financial capital is basically money. You invest your savings, you get a loan, whatever. You invest your money to start your business. But that's just one form of capital, right? There is social capital. Social capital is your connections to people, right? You know, when I lived in the Middle East, they used to call it wasta. I understand China is called guanxi, right? In Russia, it's called blat. It's the same thing. It's this idea that, okay, I've been doing a lot of favors for someone for a long time, and now it's time to call in my chips. That is social capital in action. And of course, you can burn social capital just like financial capital, right? Maybe you've got a great relationship with someone, they do a favor for you, and if you don't continue to pay favors back and forth to them, they'll stop doing things for you. Okay, you've got social capital, you have cultural capital. And I always use an example of cultural capital. You know, I'm a Army veteran. Whenever I meet other veterans, we immediately have many things to talk about. We find that we have many things in common. And this forms a very quick bond, a very quick rapport with people. You'll find this also like in immigrant communities. Oh, well, you're from this country. Well, so am I. Now we've got something to talk about. This is cultural capital, right? You need to invest cultural capital as well. Find other people that you have cultural capital with and see if they'll help you. And then communicative. And that's your ability to convince people. Kind of like in my video, normative suasion. That's based on communicative capital, or communicative rationality. It's this idea that you can extend your own credibility to convince people to do something for you. Doesn't matter which kind of capital. In Lachmann's capital theory, you need to invest that capital and set it aside for some time. Okay? Now, the other thing that he talks about that's very different from neoclassical economics is there is no need for homogeneous capital stock. In other words, a lot of our friends in neoclassical economics don't make a distinction between a capital investment in, for example, such as a desk versus a chair. They only compare the economic value of a chair versus a desk. But, you know, it's harder to liquidate, for example, maybe a table versus, a desk versus a chair, right? So it doesn't exactly make the most sense. And let's clarify that a little bit. He talks a lot about a capital structure of intermediate goods, right? And they are arranged heterogeneously. Well, if you go back to my video on effectuation, this is what they mean by heterogeneous arrangement. In other words, like I've got a table, I've got a chair, I've got a desk, and how I use that table, chair, and desk will use very different products. Or maybe let me give a better example. Think of Legos, right? Okay? Yes, from a pure neoclassical economics perspective, all of the bricks in a box of Legos are the same as all of the bricks in an identical box of Legos. Like there's the little ones, the big ones, the teeny ones. All of that's the same. Okay, I got that. However, this is where we start getting into capital structure of intermediate goods and heterogeneous arrangements. When you take those bare Legos and you stack and recombine them in different ways, you get different shapes, and those shapes can be used in different ways. That's what we talk about intermediate goods, okay? So if I take Legos, a bunch of Legos, and one person builds a tower out of those Legos, and another person builds a house, and somebody else builds a great big wall, those three shapes are intermediate goods, and they are arranged in different patterns. A wall, a tower, or a house. And there is some embodied knowledge that goes into that, okay? So for one person, you can ask someone, which is more valuable, the wall, the tower, or the house? Well, for one person, the house may be the most valuable because they have particular knowledge of how to use a house to the maximum benefit. For somebody else, the tower may be the most valuable, and for somebody else, the wall may be the most valuable, because people are different and they come to an entrepreneurial opportunity, like we talked about in effectuation, with different knowledge pathways, and therefore they use these intermediate goods differently. And that's where we get into this discussion of fossils, okay? So for every intermediate good that exists, there are some that are being actively used and some that are relics of something that occurred before, okay? I'll give an example. So my parents live in Buffalo, and across the street from where they live, there is like this it's like a big abandoned building, but on the bottom there's different kinds of businesses that can be run in there, okay? So that building, when I first came to Buffalo to stay with my parents, was abandoned. It was a fossil of a previous business that was a result of some sort of a heterogeneous arrangement of bricks, windows, mortar, blah, 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 okay? So it was an abandoned building. Well, somebody came in and they made it a photo studio, okay? They took that fossil, and with the embodied knowledge of how to make photographs, they took that fossil and they engaged in capital regrouping to turn the abandoned building into a photo studio. Well, that photo studio, for whatever reason, it didn't last, right? So then somebody else came in and they took that same shell, that same fossil of a building, and I guess it was like an African American and someone from China that were maybe a couple or business partners, because it was a Chinese soul food restaurant. Chinese soul food restaurant. Okay, that was an embodied knowledge of someone who knew how to cook soul food and somebody who knew how to cook Chinese food within that same structure, and they grouped the capital differently. You know, they put in a washer, you know, for dishwashing, kitchen, blah 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 blah. Okay, well that closed. Then the restaurant turned into some sort of an Asian restaurant. Okay, once again, it's a fossil. It's a restaurant. You know, it's Chinese soul food versus a regular Asian restaurant. Okay, that didn't work out either. Then they turned it into an MMA studio, so like boxing and UFC type fighting. Again, in that same building, I don't know what they did with the bar and the tables and stuff, but evidently they didn't use them. So they regrouped that capital in some sort of a new way. Then it turned into, they closed it, and it turned into one of those axe throwing bars, you know, where people drink beer and then they throw axes. Then it turned into that. Oh man, that fossil has been used so hard and so many times in different capital grouping as a reflection of the embodied knowledge of the different owners, right? Of course, in neoclassical economics, these things would just kind of be interchangeable, right? And that's where we get into where capital structure of intermediate goods is quite different. So it seems to work out in that particular building of being like a restaurant or an open space, but I can guarantee that place will never become a hospital, right? It's definitely not going to do that. I can guarantee you there's many kinds of businesses it will never become, but it can become a limited group. So there's not perfect interchangeability of these different forms of capital market, but in the context of an error-strewn market, in other words, based on the mistakes or the ashes of what is there before, it provides the chance for a new business to come about, right? So like the photo studio in that building that failed so hard, right? They would have never even had the chance to try had that building not been there to begin with, right? It's easier to start a photo studio in an abandoned building than to build a new building and then start a photo studio, right? Because you got to pay to build a new building. No, they just moved in. And when that failed, as it starts moving down to Chinese soul food, well, it was easier to move into a building that was already built, already kind of clean, to start a restaurant versus having to build a brand new restaurant up from scratch. So on the fossils of what's already there, that kind of facilitates new types of opportunities, new chances for a venture to actually get launched. Whew. And let's see, so that about wraps up this video. I think in the next video, we are going to briefly talk about, we've already talked about innovations. I think in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about Lachmann and institutional theory. Great. So if you like this video, go ahead and give me a subscribe, a thumbs up, all that good stuff. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next time.